Chair. Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr Robinson. Look, I'm just quite keen to talk to subpart 1, referendums on the New Zealand flag. And I agree with one of the earlier speakers when we talked about Schedule 1 and the question asked, if the New Zealand flag changes, which would you prefer? And I actually think this is quite counterintuitive. And even the RIS says, when it talks about this option, Mr Chair, and I quote, voters are unable to express a preference for the current flag in the first referendum. This is potentially confusing for voters and may also risk engagement. So what we have got here, Mr Chair, is a question that risks voters' disengagement with a process where the purpose of the bill talks about engaging voters. It's quite counterintuitive. It doesn't. It's like asking the question, if you don't want the All Blacks to win the World Cup, who would you prefer to win? I mean, we all want the All Blacks to win the World Cup, so the question is quite redundant. Which brings me on to Jacinda Ardern's SOP, which we can really, I mean, I still this down to Part 2, Clause 14, 1A, where it talks about the alternative, this is voting paper in the second referendum, Mr Chair, and it talks about the alternative flag design that was successful in the first referendum. Now, for me, it's what defines success. Now, what Jacinda has put forward is a definition of success that would allow at least 50% of the New Zealanders to have a say in what's happening. But what we have got here is we could potentially end up with a definition of success where around 15% of eligible voters make a decision that goes on to the second referendum. Now, I don't know how many people are going to vote in this referendum. We never know these things, but what we do know is that the turnout in a postal vote is usually a lot lower than it is when you have to go to the polling station. And in fact, the RIS also highlighted this fact, and the RIS actually said that the best place to have this referendum is when you are having a general election, because you turn up, you ticket, and away you go. But obviously the government and the Prime Minister decided against that option. So, Mr Chair, we could end up in quite a weird way with a flag. We've got a flag panel at the moment, and with all due respect to the last speaker, he actually got this a little wrong. The people that determine the final 4 designs are those people on the flag committee. They include people like Rod Drury. Now, Rod is an exceptionally good businessman. I don't know about his design skills. You've got Julie Christie, who actually who made the GC, heaven help us. Again, she's very successful, but I'm not too sure what her credentials are around flag design, or any sort of design for that matter. So what we could end up with, Mr Chair, is 4 people making a final decision on the flag that goes through. And how we come to this is they've got to choose 4 flags that go into the first referendum. And with 12 people on the panel, if it goes for preferential voting like a majority, you could end up with only four people choosing the flag that ends up going through to the choice between the current New Zealand flag and the final flag. But again, let's take it back to how many people here may end up vote, and so therefore the definition of success. At the last general election, Mr Chair, there was around about 2.4 million voters voted, which is not high, but it's about standard, and it's what we've come to expect in this day and age. In local body elections, where it is a postal vote, you're really lucky if you get 50% of people voting. In fact, that's quite high. And in Napier, for example, where there was a very, very strong local issue, we got about 50% voting, and that was considered by all in asunder as a high percentage for a postal vote. So let's assume we get 50% people voting in this referendum. And because it is preferential voting, as outlined in Schedule 20, which talks about the electoral systems for referendums, and it states 20.1 preferential voting system. So we could end up with, let's say, 700,000 people voting, and because it's preferential, we may end up with, in fact, about 30% of those who voted voting this as their first preference. So again, we end up with about 350,000 Kiwis determining the final vote that goes through. So 1/10 of those who are eligible to vote may end up making that decision. Now, I understand there's going to be a whole lot of advertising on this, and as Jacinda Ardern pointed out, there is no spending cap, so someone like Gareth Morgan, or perhaps, and I don't mean to cast aspersions on anyone's character in any way, shape or form, Mr Chair, but those on the voting panel, for example, there are some who are incredibly wealthy. They may want their first preference to be the flag that goes through to the final referendum. Mr Chair? Mr Chair?
John O'Naylor.
Mr Chair, it's been a really interesting debate as we've got into part two.